to be to agree on what we mean by diversity, because it can be very, very different. Obviously, psychological, physical, social differences among those individuals. But as you can see, this definition, which is by the National Multicultural Institute, starts out with what we know as the protected classes: age, gender, race, religion, mental or physical ability. But then, we want to go into things like learning patterns, cultural background, educational background, socioeconomic backgrounds. We want to broaden it and include diversity to cover all of those areas. So a diverse group is going to encompass people from a number of those different areas. Okay, next. So equity, that's a term that's been used a lot recently. So equity takes into account the fact that there are certain groups that have been disadvantaged and maybe have not had the opportunities that other groups have had in moving ahead in terms of job positions, opportunities for training, opportunities for education, advancement, and it strives to remove some of those barriers by leveling the playing field, make it possible for people who maybe previously didn't have those opportunities to have them going forward. Next, inclusion, great word, talks about being an inclusive environment where everybody feels welcome and respected, appreciated for who they are. And I think we have a graphic on the next page. I like this one because sometimes people will differ and say that equality and equity are the same, and clearly they are not. Equality is treating everybody the same, right? Where you're going to treat everyone the same regardless. And in this situation, we have, folks watching a soccer game. There's a wooden fence that you can't see through, and we give everybody a box to help them see. And tall guy on the left, he gets a box, but he doesn't really need one because he can see when he's standing on his own 2 feet. Little guy gets a box, same amount of help, but he still can't see because he's vertically challenged and is unable to see over the top of the fence. Equity is kind of giving each what they need in order to take advantage of what is being offered. And in this situation, we have tall guy giving up his box to the little guy. Tall guy can still see. The person in the middle is perfectly fine where she was before, and little guy now has the ability to see the soccer game. And I identify with little guy because I myself am vertically challenged, so I understand where he's coming from. Justice is where you remove the barrier so that everybody can access what is available without getting any assistance or help. We've removed the wooden fence with a chain link fence, so little guy can see through it. No problem there. So you've removed the barriers so that we are all on the same playing field in terms of what we're able to access.
So what is going on out there? There's a lot going on out there right now. And hate has no home here. And we want to make sure that this really heightens everyone's sensitivity and awareness that everyone is equal and should be included and feel like they're belonging within the organization. So there are various trends in the workplace: harassment, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, lack of civility, political disagreements, the war, retaliation claims surprisingly continue to rise, concerns about the economic stability, and mental health and well-being, which is another area that is first and foremost in the workplace, regardless of what the workplace is. I think before we used to say, check your baggage, check your home life at the door. And then when you're at work, you're at work. Now it's very inclusive. And I say it's intermingled, right? So if you have challenges at home, it's brought into work and vice versa. And that's just because it's just so intertwined. And a lot of these topics are intertwined, whether you're at work or at home. Excuse me. The interesting thing about the taboo topics is, as legislators, this is what you talk about on a regular basis, where in the workplace, there are topics that are taboo and people are asked not to talk about them in many cases: abortion, education, guns, immigration, freedom, First Amendment, religion, and climate change. And those are topics that, like I said, you talk about and discuss and dispute on a regular basis. And how do you navigate that in a way where people have very strong beliefs in one of those topics or the other topic? And how do you navigate those conversations while still being professional and respectful, but also coming across with what your points are? So what is discrimination? Charla spoke earlier about the protected classes. And, we also had spoken at some of the other sessions about how previously it was just a few, it was age, race, religion, and nationality. And now there's a lot more categories as things have changed in the world. Now it's marital status, veteran status, disability, gender identity, genetic information, sex, pregnancy, and national origin. And these are all protected classes, which we will intertwine in the slides that we have coming up. So what is discrimination? It's employment decisions that are based on membership in a protected class. It's making sure that when you're selecting somebody, whether it's for work or a committee or whatever the situation might be, that you're selecting the best person for the position or the organization or the legislation. It's not based on, you're not making decisions based on protected classes. Employment decisions based on stereotypes or assumptions about a protected class, and also not denying anybody because they might be associated with somebody who is considered a protected class. And one of the examples that we talked about earlier is, for that particular situation, is, I'll use Charla as an example, as let's just say you were talking to Charla and you were interviewing her and she said that she has a disabled child. And you are saying, oh, a disabled child, that means she's going to be out a lot. She has to go to doctor's appointments a lot. What happens if she can't come into work? So you don't select her for whatever the position might be. And that is where it's that the relationship between somebody who does have a disability and who doesn't.
Yeah, in that case, I'm not the disabled individual, but my child is disabled, and that's called associational discrimination by virtue of that relationship.
Any questions on that?
Okay, we'll start with a hypothetical. Tim and Miguel are the hiring managers looking to fill a number of open positions in the human resource and security departments. In meeting with the organization's recruiters, the issue of department demographics comes up. Tim mentions that they've had trouble recruiting new workers, especially younger workers, and he's concerned that succession planning efforts will be undermined without an influx of new people with new ideas. Any problem here? Anybody see any issues? Yeah, potentially, right. It's one thing to say we need new ideas, we need new blood, we need to bring new people in order to plan for the future. It's another thing to say we are going to select out a group of people to favor and look at only them to the exclusion of others. How about if we change it a little bit and we say, would it make a difference if the conversation were around the organization's DEI strategy and the need to hire more Latinx workers? And under there it says to increase diversity. Problem? Bearing in mind, this would not be an affirmative action employer which had certain criteria that they needed to meet. Just your average regular company or nonprofit or government organization. What do we think about that? Problem or no? Well, yeah, I mean, it may be for a good reason, but it's still discrimination, right? You're still selecting out. If we are saying something like, well, we're only going to look at Latinx workers, we're only going to look at people with a Hispanic background because we need more of them, then that would be discrimination because you're looking at one group to the exclusion of others. If you're saying, man, we have to increase our pool of applicants, we aren't getting any applications from people from diverse backgrounds. So we need to maybe go look in different places. We need to advertise in different places. We need to recruit differently in order to have more candidates that will bring diversity into our population. That would be fine. But the opposite, which is only hiring this group because we need more, whatever it is, men, women, Muslims, pick one, that would be a problem. That would be just as discriminatory as saying we're only going to hire white people. Next. So when you start talking about DEI, I think one of the biggest pieces of this is building trust between and among the individuals you're talking about. Very often when somebody will say, you know, we're going to start a DEI initiative, we're going to look at more diversity, we're going to talk about these things in the workplace, people can be reluctant because they don't know where people are coming from. They're not sure that it's a genuine belief that they should increase diversity in the workplace or whatever the organization might be. So that's certainly an issue or a problem. You want to create safe space, psychological safety, somewhere where people feel as though they can discuss these issues without fear of retribution, either being made fun of, being ridiculed, you know, somehow being demonized because they're the ones that are bringing up a hot topic that might be offensive to some people. Maybe fear of breach of confidentiality. So people have to feel as though they can say what's on their mind honestly, so that you can move forward with embracing different voices. You have to hear different perspectives. That's true of management teams. The most effective management teams are those that have people from different backgrounds with different types of ideas. You need people that are really creative versus people that are technically oriented. So you always want different perspectives. And one of the most important things is to learn from our differences. And how do we do that? We have conversations. So next slide. So where do you begin? We want to enhance our DEI efforts by having more thoughtful conversations. And like the opening title slide said, this is where do we begin, not where do we end. So we want to talk about this as a starting point, involving all employees, individuals, and I use the term employees, embracing the legislators, embracing staff, whoever may be involved. And then this piece, creating a workplace in which all employees feel welcome and can be their authentic selves, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual identity, whatever that difference might be. And so what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean when I say bring your authentic self, bringing the worst side of yourself, your unfiltered side, without any ability to hold back and stop yourself from saying something potentially inappropriate or doing something potentially inappropriate. It's your authentic self in terms of your identity, so that you don't have to hide who you are. You don't have to feel uncomfortable talking about your family life because maybe somebody may not approve of that. So you want to be your authentic self at work, your whole self. Next.
But I didn't mean to offend. There's a lot of times where people say something without the intent to hurt somebody, right? You don't wake up in the morning and come to work and say, I am going to be mean to so-and-so today, right? A lot of it is just the education and the awareness of the situation. So intent is what a person means to do or meant to do, and impact is what it means to the person receiving it. How does it impact and affect the person receiving the information? I did a similar training yesterday for a client, and one of them said, well, what happens if I ask? And what I said to them is, if you have to ask to say something or to joke about something or to draw a picture, you probably shouldn't do it, right? So err on the side of caution. If you have to ask if something is okay, right? Now that's a little different than saying, can you help me understand? Or I'd like to learn a little bit more. That's a very different situation. Rather than saying, hey, is it okay? Do you mind if I say this joke? Do you mind if I say this racial joke or this ethnicity joke? And they're going to probably look at you and be like, well, why are you asking, right? Why are you even thinking to ask? So it's really, what is your intent? But it can be perceived by the person receiving the information. And that's where some of the challenges are, is making sure that you're thinking before you speak or draw or say a joke. And if you're not sure it's okay, err on the side of caution and don't do it. Any questions on that?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. One of the examples I use, because I often use my family members as examples in these trainings because they're a wealth. On an occasion when I once said to my husband, "You hurt my feelings." And he said, "No, I didn't." And I went, "Wait a minute, they're my feelings, and this is how I took what you were saying." And he could say, I was just kidding. Still hurt my feelings, how I took it. It was a joke that fell flat on me. Could say, "It's the truth." Maybe it's the truth, still hurt my feelings. It's how it impacted me. And that is the difference between intent and impact. We can make missteps, and most people will give you grace if you make a misstep and apologize. But if it is repeated behavior, or if it's behavior that really has a negative impact on you, makes you feel as though, you've been hurt deeply by something, then it's the impact on the person that makes a more significant difference. And in some areas of the law, like retaliation, it almost doesn't matter what your intent was. If the impact has perhaps been to punish somebody for having filed a claim, then that is where the retaliation comes in, and where you potentially may have a legal problem, as opposed to whether or not you intended to punish them for doing whatever it is that they did. The next slide, I think, talks about another set of terms that sometimes gets conflated, but are really two very different things: bias and bigotry. So we all have bias. Sometimes biases can be positive, in favor of some group of people, in favor of a person. Sometimes biases can be a negative inclination towards someone or a group of people. They can come about many different ways: through your cultural upbringing, family upbringing, through your education, through what you were exposed to. There's a friend of mine whom I do co-presentations with from time to time, and she grew up in the South. And very often she'll say, "Well, in the South, when somebody calls you dear or bless your heart, that is not a positive thing," where, we in the North don't really talk that way to people. But, what is your upbringing? What are you used to? How do you interpret things? And one example that I have been giving today about that is when I first became a partner in my law firm, and I found myself starting to give more assignments to female associates. And, why was that? Well, people I might have more in common with, people I might feel a responsibility to mentor and to bring along, because, you want to help other women. People I was going to be spending a lot of time with if we were working on cases, so I'd feel more comfortable with them. And I realized, like, wait a minute, your bias is in favor of the female employees, and you really need to start thinking about offering those same opportunities to the men, because they may want to do employment cases as well. So I sort of discovered that bias, sort of myself, and said, okay, you have to correct for that and start making an effort to be more fair in how you give out your assignments. And that would be a bias, and you're capable of overcoming it. Bigotry is very different. Bigotry, it can be intolerance. It can be, glorifying, your group, whatever it may be. Girls are better than boys, or men are better than women, to the detriment of another group. So we're better than you, whoever you may be. Yeah.
Bless your heart,
But in the South, it's a term that is used to say, like, bless your heart, you're such a fool. In that people use it in that way.
I disagree. Two of our kids live in the South, and it's meant to be nothing but polite.
Really?
Just say bless your heart.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it is definitely a tone.
that with any set of words, I'm sure, but I think that question probably should go to the Southern.
Yeah. Because the person who, she brings it up when we do trainings together. She's from the South, and she said and she is presenting it from her perspective, that when she hears and heard, like, bless your heart, dear, it's like it was given in that terminology. Yeah, with that. Well, we've got some other ones that we may have some disagreement too as we go on about how they're used and whether they've.
Down there is another term of endearment. They do the same thing.
Yeah, I don't.
It's another. They mean it nothing but polite. Everything I've done with people, it's
really
common.
Exactly.
Yeah, I suppose I could say.
I grew up there for 24 years, but. There's a lot of comments that it's the tone, right? Sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it and how it can be perceived and how it is said.
Yeah, like we'll sometimes hear in trainings, especially around sexual harassment issues, you can't say anything anymore. You can't compliment anybody. You can't tell somebody they look nice. And that's not the case. You could certainly say, you look very nice today, or I like that dress, but ooh, I love those jeans. That would potentially have, a sexual connotation to it. So the delivery is actually very important. And frankly, that's not my example. So I'm kind of sorry I brought it up. Because I've never even used that terminology. So this is just a little wordle of some of the language that, we hear. And I will say many of these terms, when I heard them for the first time, I had to look them up. Because the lexicography has changed. People use different terminology, for different things. And, we've talked about how things have changed over decades and decades about how people refer to one another, how people refer to certain groups. So part of this is, we're going to talk about just a few of these, but part of it is educating yourself on that. So next one. So first is ally, and we often hear this term used in the racial area, where if there's a belief and an understanding that certain groups have been oppressed or treated poorly, and you are dedicated, even though you are not a member of that particular group, to helping to alleviate whatever it might be. Oppression might be discrimination against that particular group. It may be poor treatment, so that you acknowledge that there has been an issue and you want to help to correct it. It's not only used in that context. I recently wrote an article about being an ally, a mental health ally in the workplace, where someone you may know and work with may be struggling with mental health issues, and you may want to assist them in some fashion. So you're an ally in helping them to get to resources they need, helping to talk to them, be a voice, be a sounding board for their concerns and their ideas. And having that ability or dedication to help in that situation would make you an ally. Cultural competence is having the ability, knowledge, understanding to relate to people from different cultures and perspectives. And a lot of this is educating oneself. This really, I heard it for the first time when I was on the board of directors of a low-income health center, where we had a lot of refugees in the population. They were coming in, bringing their children in with different medical conditions, and would be using home remedies that they had learned in their countries of origin. And the doctors, the nurses had to kind of learn to speak with them about what they were doing and how there may be some remedies in Western medicine that might be more helpful, but they had to approach it from the right perspective, where they weren't insulting that person's culture or the methods and remedies that had been used on them by their grandparents. So it took a certain amount of cultural competence. A lot of medical providers got training in that area to be able to talk to people in a way that respected their culture but got them the services that they needed. Implicit bias, I mentioned it when we talked about bias. Bias can be implicit, can be unconscious. Generally, they're negative biases and assumptions. They are not, they're not, how do I say it? They're not an attempt to denigrate somebody. Generally, they come through without you even realizing that you have them. That's why they're called unconscious. But they can often affect your attitudes and your behaviors towards people, the way you interact with people. And there may be some significant, real-world implications which you might not even be aware of because you have these biases. So that's why, I learned a lot. First couple of times I took really good unconscious or implicit bias trainings about ways that, my childhood or my life may have shaped me. My education may have shaped me in the way I dealt with things. And I will say, for example, my grandmother She grew up in the Depression. Before that, she was a survivor of the Armenian genocide. She came to this country with nothing. And when we would go to restaurants, she'd want to take everything home. She wanted to take the bread home because she knew it was going to get thrown out, and she could not handle the thought of wasting food. So she would take everything home with her. And I would just be sitting there going, oh my God, like, she's embarrassing me. I can't believe she's doing this. And then, I learned her own upbringing, her what she had been through was a bias where she thought it was very negative to leave anything behind. And, she did what she had to do in order to feel comfortable in those circumstances because of the way that she was raised.
So fostering a respectful workplace, civility, courtesy, professionalism, respect, and equity. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is you might not understand where somebody is coming from, or you might not like where somebody is coming from, but appreciating and respecting their opinion or their background or whatever the case may be is making sure that even though you might not understand it or you don't agree with it, that it's with a level of professionalism and respect. There was about a handful of months ago, I was asked to go into an organization there was mistreatment of an individual who was transgender. And the transgender individual felt that it was more an education as opposed to them being treated differently. And a lot of it was people didn't understand or appreciate. And so we approached it from an educational standpoint because nothing that was being said or done had malintent. It was the education of the situation. And just because somebody might not understand or appreciate where they're coming from, it's making sure that you still are respectful and professional to the individual. And making sure that, again, even you don't have to like somebody, you have to be able to work with them, right? And when you're speaking about various legislative topics, you're speaking about some really sensitive issues, and you're going to have some hot buttons and some emotion perhaps surrounding that. And how do you demonstrate that? And how do you make sure that that individual is being heard and that you are being receptive to that and vice versa? And making sure that you're avoiding conduct that is offensive, rude, or demeaning, or threatening. One of the things that is really important, and this happened just the other day, was in an investigation, there was one employee who found out that they had made a complaint about something. And that employee went up to them and threatened them and said, "You're going to get what you have coming to you because you ratted us out." That is a threat. That's extreme, but that does happen. So you want to make sure that just because somebody has a thought process or they came forward and shared a concern, that concern is important to them, and you want to make sure that it's addressed and treated professionally and respectfully.
So another hypothetical, Sam has a stutter. At management meetings, when Sam reports to the group about the status of his projects, Walter will interrupt him and say things like, "We can't understand you," or he'll restate what Sam said. What you're really trying to say is, Sam has never said anything about it, and others in management meetings have said nothing. Is there anything wrong with this? Yeah, I mean, what are we seeing there? Incivility, rudeness. Yeah, lack of patience. Yep. Definitely an inappropriate way to handle this situation. Any thoughts on what might be a better way to handle that? Yeah, maybe have a conversation with him, saying, "Hey, do you need any help when you're doing the presentations? Can I be of assistance to you?" And Sam might say, "I really prefer to do my reports in writing." Or Sam might say, "I need practice. I really want to practice talking." And if that's the case, you're going to allow Sam to do his presentation. It all depends on how he feels about it. Does he feel as though Walter is helping him or being rude to him? Does he want to do his presentations like all of the other managers do it? Or would he prefer to do it in a different way? So yeah, I mean, I think approaching him offline, I think, is the best way to do it. See what the reaction is. Hope the manager probably should have done that from the very beginning. What if Sam were Samantha and Walter was telling her to speak more loudly so everyone could hear her and kept restating her points? Well, what Samantha really meant was, what do we think about that? It's rudeness either way.
And saying, okay, Walter, I'm understanding you're having trouble understanding what's going on. So let's see if we can figure out a way.
Yep. That's a good perspective.
Dynamic between who's thinking Walter are clear in this, which is why I didn't answer.
Yeah, they were clearly their coworkers, at least if from the situation that this comes from, they were coworkers. There was a manager who did not handle it, which, as you say, probably should have been the one handling it from the beginning. And what about the Samantha situation? I get what you're saying, that doesn't matter if you're interrupting or, talking over someone or restating their ideas, that's a problem. Anybody get any other perspective on that in terms of how Samantha might be reacting to that? Could be gender-based, could be, telling her she needs to, like, one of the terms that used to sort of frost me when we used to do associate evaluations when they used to say that females needed to speak with more confidence. So what does that mean exactly? Do they speak too softly? Do they not speak up enough? Let's be specific about what the issues are. Well, they're supposed to be intentionally. Yeah. No, it's a different scenario. There's no stutter in scenario 2. It's just a female who is stating her points and being sort of talked over and restated. Yeah. So it's kind of two different scenarios, but ultimately same problem. Somebody who's being uncivil and rude, and probably a manager, facilitator of this meeting, whoever is the head of this group, should have stepped in early on. Let Samantha finish her point. Let Sam finish his presentation. Okay. Anything else on this one? All right.
So we covered a lot of this already, creating a respectful and make sure that there's civility in your workplace, being mindful of addressing problems of others, making sure that you're self-aware. A lot of it too is not just what's verbal, but also is what is written. There's a lot of people who will fire off an email because people might be bold behind a computer. They'll fire
Keyboard
off
warriors.
Keyboard warriors. They'll fire off an email or a text or something and not really be sensitive to how it's coming across. And I think when you're writing something, it's even more important to be aware of how you're coming across because it's written and people can't get the whole picture. They can't see your body language and what your actual intent is. So it's being aware of what you're writing. We talked about the hot buttons, and it's fine if there's a lot of emotion involved for you to say, hey, you know what, time out, this isn't being productive. Let's take a step back and revisit the conversation when we can have a more productive conversation where our emotions are not as heightened. And it's a lot of these things are common sense in day to day. And I think sometimes people get comfortable and complacent, and it's not always top of mind. And this is just the reminder to keep that when you're communicating and interacting with people in the workplace.
Can you go back to that one for a
Yeah.
sec? Because just at the very end there, it mentions being mindful of and addressing problem behaviors. This kind of goes back to the allyship that I talked about, where one of the most helpful ways to stop problematic behavior is for peers to speak up. And you can go back to, schoolhouse bullying training where, you're training middle school kids on how not to bully one another. And you talk about empowering them to speak up when one of their fellow students is doing something that's of a bullying nature to another kid. It has a lot more effect in stopping bad behavior if a peer says, hey, knock it off, leave Jimmy alone, as opposed to when a teacher says it, for example. So when peers can bring to the attention of other, whether your fellow legislators, whether they're staff members, whoever they might be, hey, you might have offended Susie by what you say. You want to be more careful about that, not to embarrass them publicly, but maybe take them aside and have that conversation. That can be more effective than, the supervisor or the boss calling you out on that behavior, because people want approval from one another, from the people they work with on a day-to-day basis. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And sometimes it's easier for somebody else to speak up, because if it's the individual who's receiving the information, they might not feel comfortable saying something, or they might laugh at something because they want to fit in, or they don't feel that they should, they feel comfortable saying something on a joke or a comment or what have you. Because not everybody wants to speak up for themselves. So having that opportunity, I think, is helpful. And sometimes it's the small things, right? Like, I'll give you an example. In my world is for the longest time in my executive, when I was at corporate and I was an HR executive, I'd be around the table with a bunch of white men, and I was the only female and usually the youngest individual around the table. Sam, can you order the food? Sam, can you take the minutes of the meeting? And I'm like, I would say, let's take turns. I'm not the only one just because I'm female or because I'm the youngest. And it took me a while to speak up, to say something, because I needed to feel safe that I could say something. Granted, I was really frustrated and I was going to say something anyway, but it takes time for people to get the nerve to say something. So sometimes if people are seeing that, speaking up on their behalf and being their ally is helpful, and that person appreciates it.
Okay, so the couple of things that I think bear discussion in this slide. The first, diversity reflects differences within a group. Very often we'll hear somebody referred to as a diverse individual. So individuals aren't diverse, it's a group that's diverse. Or we'll hear something like, that person's a DEI hire, which is never said in a positive way. Always with some kind of, I would say maybe an aspersion being cast upon someone, that they are somehow lesser and got away with something, got, hired or into a school because of their diversity. So that's something that people really need to be careful of. And really, I think one of the important things about inclusion is making sure that people feel as though they are part of a group, as though they are welcome. Their ideas are welcome. You may not have to agree with them, but that you listen to them, you take their ideas into account, and that they're appreciated for what they bring to a conversation or a situation. Next.
So what can we do? Avoid assumptions about certain individuals. Just because they might be of a certain gender or race or in a protected class, it doesn't mean that there's an assumption surrounding them, right? If you see a tall African-American, oh, he's a basketball player, something like that.
If he's old, he can't work with technology because older people don't understand technology.
Yes.
Sure. No, I think that is a, I try to refer to people the way they want to be referred to. And African American for Americans of African descent, not all Black Americans, but of African descent have indicated that that's the way they wish to be identified. And so that's what I do, as long as it's accurate. I mean, yes, they're all Americans and you would like to get to the point where it wouldn't matter, but right now it still does. Was it you or your, yeah, you were going.
The see something, say something. I like to say it's see something, hear something, say something, because it's not just seeing, it's also hearing, because lots of times it's people are speaking or saying something that really has an impact on somebody. And when you hear or see something that you feel is harassment, discrimination, retaliation, come forward and say something. And there are so many different avenues here that you can, whether you're in the House, the Senate, going to human resources, there's various ways that you can make sure that the appropriate people are aware to help with the situation. The other thing that I also like to remind people and talk about is if you are around a situation like that and you know it's not right and you're not participating, but you're also not saying something, what do you think the perception of that is? That you're condoning it, that you agree with it. And it's much harder to say something than to not say something. But when you see that, again, being the ally of the individual, of the recipient of that kind of behavior, whether it's, physical or verbal or what have you, is sticking up for that person and making sure that you help them get the assistance they need, or you yourself come forward on their behalf. But again, it's see something, say something, and it ultimately is the right thing to do.
So microaggressions, topic that, we really think is important to talk about. It's definitely a hot button one at this point. I like to refer to microaggressions as death by 1,000 cuts. It's not one big issue, which would probably be an aggression or aggressive behavior, but it could be subtle. It could certainly be unintentional, and it might express a prejudiced attitude against a certain group or individual. As it says, they're slight, they're brief, but they add up. You hear something one time, may not be a big deal. You hear it 4 or 5 times, and there's a cumulative effect, and it can have a more significant impact. Next slide. So the Society for Human Resources is the largest trade association in the world for human resource professionals. Samantha and I are both members of it. They do a lot of different things. They do studies, they do surveys, they write white papers, they have conferences, they advocate on the federal level for legislation that is workplace appropriate, business appropriate. And a 2019 survey they did, so it's a few years old, they found that 26% of adults said they had definitely experienced a microaggression at work. 36% said they had witnessed it. And none of this says who the aggressor was. So maybe it was a coworker, maybe it was a supervisor, maybe it was a member of the public with whom they had to interact. And another 20% were unsure if they had experienced or witnessed a microaggression, which is interesting because maybe people aren't real clear on what they are. So I was doing a training about a month ago to a board of directors, and it was specific to microaggressions because there was an issue in that particular workplace about microaggressions. So I was doing some additional research, and I found an article, Top 10 Microaggressions to Avoid. And I said, oh, okay. I think it was either Harvard Business Review or Forbes. I don't remember at the moment. But when I read the list and noted that at least 5 of them had been used by this particular group, I said, all right, this is a good article for me to bring to the attention of this group. So here's a few. Saying a Black person is articulate or well-spoken. I think we can remember when Barack Obama was running for president, people were saying, oh, he's so articulate, he's such a good speaker, like that was somehow a surprise that he would be a good speaker. A Harvard Law School educated Black man would be a good speaker. So, there was a lot of tongue-in-cheek about that. There was a lot of discussion around why would they say that about him when they don't say it about, every other person who runs for president. Claiming to be colorblind or saying they don't see black and white, people will look at this as disingenuous. People will we recognize gender. We recognize how people look. We recognize where people come from. We know that, and frankly, we don't want to erase that. We all want to be accepted for who we are, and saying I don't see color just doesn't ring true. Asking Black men and women if they went to college on an athletic scholarship, similar to what Sam was saying about assuming a tall Black man is a basketball player. Saying we need younger people around here for whatever reason. New ideas, new blood, somebody to work the technology for whatever reason. Asking where someone's originally from, especially if they have, features of a particular ethnic group, ethnicity. So where are you from? From New York. No, where are you really from? Where are your people from? Not accepting that as an answer and wanting. Now, that's different from approaching from a place of curiosity to say, gee, I'm going to Italy. Do you have relatives in Italy? Different kind of conversation. Yeah. Right. Right. No. Yeah. Right. Right. No, I totally get what you're saying. And a lot of it is, yes, where are you coming from? What's the reasoning behind it? As opposed to most of the kind of remarks that you hear that could be microaggressions are sort of like off the cuff. They can be tongue in cheek. They can be, I mean, if there's a serious discussion around the fact that we are not diverse and we do not represent adequately the state that we're serving, that's a valid and real conversation to have. Yeah. Saying a woman is too emotional to be a leader. Anybody heard that one before? She's so emotional. Well, how is she emotional? Does she overreact? Does she yell at people? And would you be calling out a guy if he was doing the same thing? And it's funny because somebody may not look at that. It may look at that and say, well, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But for women, that can be a real trigger word. And the one I used to say was the trigger word for me when I was looking at reviews of young female attorneys that people had written was commitment. Is she really committed to this job? I used to refer to it as the C word, like, well, what does that mean? Because she needs to pick up her kids at daycare, she's not committed, or because she drops off her kids at daycare and comes in later? Why are you saying she's not committed? If she's failing in some respect, where there are expectations that aren't being met, that's one thing. But if you're using words like emotional or commitment, you really have to back them up with facts because they can be very, very triggering to women that have experienced discrimination in the workplace.
There's a couple other women ones too. You're too sensitive. Women are too sensitive, or you need thicker skin. And those are microaggressions as well.
Yeah. Yep. Asking a woman if you can touch her hair, especially if she's got an ethnic hairstyle, or a pregnant woman if you could touch her belly. Using terminology which brings in mental health. Like, he looks like he could go postal any day now. The weather is bipolar. Like, we've all used expressions like that. I will never stand up here and say I never called a client psycho or called an opposing counsel psycho. I mean, those are words that sometimes come out of your mouth. And then you think about it in terms of, what if somebody who's struggling with a mental health issue or someone who has just had a child commit suicide hears that? Identifying inanimate objects or individuals with mental health issues when you really don't know that they have mental health issues, even if you do, is probably crossing the line, and you want to be careful of. Now I'm going to throw this one out there when we talked about a term that created controversy in the other sessions. And this is directly from the article. I didn't make it up. Using outdated terminology which has racial undertones, like let's call a spade a spade. And several people had said, I never heard that. I mean, I've heard it, but I've never heard that it attributed to being a racial comment. I have heard that, but that was, we talked about, certain terminology that people take in different ways. Culturally, that's been one that has been a problem. Dismissing complaints as misunderstandings. He didn't mean to offend. In other words, excusing bad behavior. That's just Joe being Joe. You can't take it seriously because, he talks like that to everybody. That's just the way he is. Or he didn't mean it, he was just kidding, trying to rationalize and justify bad behavior. I got a few other ones that didn't necessarily come from that article, but were ones that I have experienced or handled, not personally experienced, but have had to address in workplaces, assuming a Latino coworker is an immigrant, complimenting their English speaking. Wow, you speak really good English. Well, I was born in New York. Yeah, I speak good English. Asking only women and younger staff to order lunch, take notes, pick up muffins for meetings. You know, as Samantha mentioned, sometimes in workplaces, you know, the housekeeping chores tend to fall to women. Who empties the dishwasher in the kitchen? Who takes the coffee cups out of the sink? A lot of times nobody else touches it, and that you know, falls to women, and women start to feel like, hey, this is something that we should be taking turns doing. Accusing women or people of color of being too angry or aggressive when the same behavior is viewed positively in white men. You know, 1984, I moved to Northern New England as a female attorney. Yeah, I mean, you say things a certain way, you talk to people a certain way, which you've seen other people do, primarily your male mentors, and you're the B word for acting that way or writing an assertive letter or being assertive. It's deemed too aggressive. Has it gotten better? Yeah, but it's still out there. And telling women they should smile more. You're very unapproachable. You always look crabby. If you smiled more, people will feel more comfortable coming to your office, talking to you. Not the best. Okay. So you want to go to this one, Sam?
I can't read it because there's
Oh,
stuff all over the
then I
screen,
will do
so-
it.
Okay.
Leroy and Mike are the only two African-American employees in the department. Their manager consistently calls them both Leroy. They laugh it off and joke about it at first, but after a couple of weeks, they get frustrated and go to the department director to complain. Any problem here? I'm seeing some nodding. What do we think? Problem? Yeah. 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 It could be discriminatory, disrespectful that you haven't learned their names. You know, yeah, you could make the mistake the first time that, you know, you see the second person and you've not met them. Maybe if they look a little bit alike, I mean, you could give somebody a pass for once, but if this is consistently happening, not real respectful. And what I use as an example is the first two female partners in the law firm that I used to work in, who predated me by about 10 years or so. So they were called regularly by a senior partner as the blonde on the first floor and the blonde on the second floor. And, you know, many years later, they were sort of telling this as a joke. They were probably in their 60s at the time and kind of looked back at it and said, oh, you know, yeah, remember when so-and-so. And then it became kind of a joke, and people referred to them that they looked nothing alike. One worked in real estate, the other one worked in litigation. One was on the first floor, one was on the second. There was literally nothing similar about them other than the fact that they were both women and they were both blondes. And it was like somebody could not bother to learn their names, very disrespectful to them. And really, you know, they made light of it many years later, but I can imagine it did not go over well when it was happening at the time. So probably something that should be talked about. This is just a little graphic that I like to kind of reiterate the point that rights are not like pie. If you give rights to one person, you're not taking rights away from someone else. We want to talk about equitable and respectful workplaces. And then we're going to quickly go over where do you go if you have an issue, concern. The House has a policy on the prevention of discrimination, governs the conduct of House members and all staff, meaning all staff to both houses as well as all other staff. If conduct of a House member is called into question, then you want to contact a member of the House Panel for the Prevention of Discrimination. If a conduct of a staff member is at issue, contact Legislative Office of Human Resources. Next slide. Senate does not have a separate policy, but discriminatory conduct violates Senate's expectations for conduct becoming of a senator. If a conduct of a senator is at issue, contact a member of the Senate Ethics Panel or the Secretary of the Office of the Secretary of the Senate. And this is important information for you to either have yourselves or to be able to convey to anyone who might come to you with an issue or concern that they might have. One of the most important things is that we know where to send people if we're not the person to deal with a particular issue that's being brought up. And I think that does it. Any questions? Yeah. Meaning what? Like a group's? Oh, I think that is far better in terms of a format. I think that what we are doing here is a function of the number of people we have to talk to, the amount of time we have. And, you know, I tend to do this kind of thing in a couple of hours where we have sort of, well, yeah, and to have people talk to each other. And I like to encourage, I think you just make such a really good point, is that I like to encourage people to speak up so that you can hear from one another. And sometimes in these sessions, someone will speak up and say, this happened to me, maybe not here, but somewhere else. And, you know, you can learn much better from one another than from me standing up here and talking to you. No question about it. Just think this is sort of the beginning of a conversation. Oh, I didn't take it that
No,
way.
not at
Yeah,
all.
no. Black. Yep. I think at this point, and I wish there was somebody here who could tell me because I would rather hear it from a Black person, but I think they're both okay right now. Which is not to say, and I'm sensitive to this, that it doesn't change because obviously, you know, when I was a kid, the terminology was different. In 1965, you know, it changes and it becomes sort of collective wisdom. Sometimes it has, yeah, it may or may not have something to do with the story, but you know, have you ever seen somebody get up in arms when they started talking about maybe they were going to have like a Black James Bond? Like, oh my God, we can't have a Black James. Yeah, yeah, which is exactly right, which is why, you know, you can have different actors who are, or Doctor Who became a woman, right? The first Doctor Who was a man, but now we have female Doctor Who's. Yeah.
We're all legislators. Right. As a body, we all have to identify and then in our social gathering, we spend some time in the cafeteria. They're typical clusters of one party sitting one end. I have the unique 2% situation. I'm an independent.
Oh.
I have a great number of friends that are more in our category, and I often might have breakfast with them. They're close colleagues. But I will have lunch in other areas, and I got a comment one day. We see who you sat with.
Oh, yeah.
We see who you've been sitting with, and I said, do you have a problem with that?
Yeah.
I said, I think it's our responsibility
Talk to each other.
to
Yeah.
interact,
Yeah.
get to understand
Yeah.
how other legislators, regardless of their affiliation, develop relationships. In fact, we can't represent.
Yeah.
Committed to learn about dialogue develop a relationship.
There's less of that now, though, isn't there? And I'm not talking of just specifically right here, but everywhere.
So I
Turned it into a positive. Yeah.
it turned into really, we're envious.
Yeah.
Wish we could.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we all have an opportunity, responsibility. Meanwhile, this.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect way of putting it.
You have to get out of your comfort.
Totally. And
And how you handled that situation was professional, right? It wasn't, I'm gonna give you shaming right back or dig right back just because of it. Because it's not productive when you have conversations like that, and it doesn't resolve anything. It just adds fuel to the fire.
I mean, after all, Justice Scalia and Justice Bader Ginsburg were like the best of friends. And you think, how did that happen? They had respect for one another as individuals, professionals, and they developed a really lovely relationship. Well, no, they were friends until he died. They were, yeah.
I think also to go back to the question that you had is it's always better to have more dialogue in these trainings, but I think there was a conscious decision made to have more trainings, smaller groups, so people would feel more comfortable asking questions or speaking up as opposed to having a large group. Because when you have a large group, sometimes people they won't say anything at all because they don't feel comfortable. So
We appreciate your interacting with us and asking really good questions.
thank
Thanks.
you.
Take care. Bye-bye now. Thank you.